Okay, wonderful. Thank you for those of you who've made it today, and thank you so much for the panellists who's made time to join this session. Thanks for the invitation from Scientists for Labour. So I've been asked to chair this session called Britain Reconnected for Pandemic Preparedness, Defending Our Security and Prosperity. So really thinking about the critical questions related to pandemic preparedness, and this is really top of mind because of what's happened in the last few years. The reactions and the responses that we've had all around the world, where we thought we would, in the countries where we thought we'd have a good response and where we didn't, and how we're still feeling the repercussions of that. But also the impact this has had on global cooperation across the world and what we might be able to do, and specifically what the Labour Party has the opportunity to do to improve things, and foreign policy very specifically. So very quickly, I will introduce my esteemed colleagues. But first of all, I should say my name is Dr Ines Hassan. I'm from the Blair Institute for Global Change, and I'm the director of the Global Health Security Consortium. This is headed up by Sir John Bell, Tony Blair, and Dr David Davis from the Ellison Institute. And we're very much focused on working very closely with world leaders, making sure actually that they are still remembering that the impact of the pandemic is still being felt and that we need to be prepared for the next one. And the fact that actually because of climate change and all sorts of things like travel and global movement, we're going to have more and more pandemics. And actually Affinity predict that there's a 27% chance we're going to have the next pandemic in the next 10 years. I'm actually more worried what's going to happen this winter with the increased burden of disease. But actually, sadly, a lot of the world leaders we talk to at the moment have forgotten the pandemic already. So we're trying to think of ways about how we can help them strengthen their health systems pragmatically, because obviously money is the issue here, improving population health, but also being prepared for the pandemic going forward. It's an approach we call always on, which I can talk to any of you about afterwards. Anyway, without further ado, let me introduce the panel. So on my furthest left, I have Wayne David.
Geographically speaking,
Labour MP, yes. Labour MP for Caerphilly, who has served as a Member of Parliament since 2001. He's a Shadow Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Minister for the Middle East and North Africa. Obviously, top of mind what's happening in the region, as I'm sure is for most of us. And he was formerly the Labour Wales Office Minister. On my left also, we've got Zander Woollcombe, Senior Advisor of the Pandemic Action Network, who we at GHSE work very closely with. And they are a partnership of over 350 global multi-sector organisations, very much focused on the fight still against COVID and just making sure governments around the world are prepared. Zander, please, you can talk more about your background. On my right, I've got Evie, who's the director of the British Foreign Policy Group, and her primary research focus are on domestic consent foreign policy, the UK's role in the world, and challenges posed by the UK's strategic rivals. And then last but definitely not least, Clara Collingwood, who's the campaign manager and senior policy officer for a really important group. We've done tremendous work called the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice. Okay. Thank you, guys. So we're not going to do introductory statements. We're just going to dive into discussions right away. It's going to be a very kind of informal discussion, and then we'll leave some time for questions from the audience. So I'm going to start off with Clara. Thinking about the response to the pandemic, and we all have our thoughts on how that went, and there's been obviously the COVID inquiry going on. So how do you think COVID-19 has reshaped our approach in Britain to pandemic preparedness and national security across the kind of devolved governments? Is there anything good that has changed, and what are your main concerns?
I think I would say that so far it hasn't shaped it at all. But it has exposed how woefully unprepared we were to begin with. The reason why the pandemic played out in a way that highlighted and thrived on inequalities, and that's become something. That's something that we've already been able to see from the beginning of the pandemic, and the impact of that is only growing, and this is coming out in the inquiry. And the UK COVID-19 inquiry has just had its module on pandemic preparedness, which is, of course, 50% of the battle when it comes to pandemics. And the fact of the matter is that the UK was utterly unprepared. Firstly, we prepared for one kind of flu, which then meant that there was kind of nothing no work was done to prepare for any kind of mitigating responses. The idea was just that it would be a flu that you couldn't prevent from spreading from person to person. And so the focus was on planning around morgue space, bleakly. So I think that what's come out from the inquiry is that there are a number of things that we can do and that the Labour Party, once in government, must do from the very earliest moment. And that revolves around things like having a Minister for Preparedness and Resilience, and having we would have a responsibility to make sure that there's a whole of government approach, because at the minute resilience for pandemics sits within one ministerial area, and of course the health department has a very big important role to play in pandemic response, but it's only a small part of it, particularly when we're thinking about the fact that whatever the next pandemic is, or even just the next kind of massive crisis, it is very likely to be a whole system shock again. I think also there needs to be change to civil contingencies planning, in civil contingencies legislation, to ensure that the people who are tasked with responding and saving lives in pandemics are also being supported further upstream in the system by the people who control the purse strings and make sure that they're able to do that in the first place. And then just kind of broadly and finally, I think a very important point is that the state of health inequality in the UK is so woeful after 10 years of underfunding of public services, and again, all public services, not just the NHS. And it's absolutely crucial that I think that, going forward for pandemic preparedness, statements of intent are made about making sure that we reduce health inequalities, and that also involves collecting a lot of data around the black hole in data when it comes to BAME inequalities and other kind of social and health inequalities has really shaped the way that the pandemic's gone across so far. And in terms of international relations, I don't know so much about that. However, there are things that, in terms of kind of devolved nations, in Northern Ireland, the same civil contingencies legislation that protects the rest of the UK doesn't extend over there. And you can understand why that was brought about in the first place. But at the same time, when there's no sitting executive and there's no government, it means that the people of Northern Ireland are kind of grievously and specifically vulnerable. So I think that's the kind of thing that has to be addressed as soon as possible, and is near enough to foreign policy as I know anything about.
No, that's wonderful, thank you. And please take down any questions you might have for Clara, and we'll take them all at the end. So thinking about what Clara discussed about how we were woefully unprepared, and we used a kind of a flu pandemic response, and which obviously didn't work in the UK. And actually, one of the reasons we did eventually do well in the UK in terms of pandemic response is because we had mostly thriving life science industry, and so we managed to do well eventually. But it was very much a stop-start approach. We were unprepared, and also sadly what we've done is we've dismantled a lot of the infrastructure and the approaches that we built during the pandemic. So for example, if we take vaccine delivery, we set up all these vaccine delivery hubs, we set up all these digital registries, we trained people to be able to vaccinate, so that very specific example, but since then we've dismantled it. So considering kind of this stop-start approach or panic and neglect cycles in pandemic preparedness, if I turn to you, Evie, now, and thinking about Labour's focus on longer-term thinking and building resilience into the 21st century, how can we do more to prevent more pandemics or respond better to pandemics?
No, it's fine. I'll just shout. Can you hear me at the back? I'll still ask one more. So I think there's a real challenge in general in long-term thinking. I think there's more mics somewhere. Thank you very much. There's a general challenge that we have in policy in general in getting long-term thinking, and I think that's particularly a challenge in foreign policy. So those of you that are foreign policy wonks will have known there was an integrated review in 2021, which kind of setting out the UK's vision for foreign policy. Then we had Russia invade Ukraine, and suddenly we had a whole new strategy in 2023. And actually, under a Labour government, I think we'll probably end up with another new strategy that looks broadly similar, but there'll be some notable changes. And the challenge with foreign policy is that there are so many variables outside of your control. You can't control what other states do, and actually, so many challenges, climate, health, etc., are cross-border now. So actually, there are very few challenges that you can really address primarily domestically. And And the real challenge that we have to think about the long term, but in an environment which doesn't encourage thinking about the long term. And some of the ways that I think we can encourage that, I think there are three. The first is looking at kind of how it intersects with other issues and what issues that we do think about long term. So obviously there's less of a consensus than there was a month ago on climate change, but in general we do think in a sort of long-term-ish way about climate change. So the more you can intersect health and climate, I think that there is value there in bringing that. The other one I think is women and girls, which is increasingly getting quite cross-party consensus around women and girls. Lots of health issues disproportionately affect women, they disproportionately affect people from marginalised communities. So the more we can intersect how you address women and girls issues through addressing health, I think there's a real kind of benefit to be gained there. And there's also outside of kind of the foreign policy sphere, if you, for example, attach to things like the NHS, everybody cares about the NHS, everybody thinks, it's underfunded, but also uses all the money, etc. Simultaneously, the more that we can actually prevent these issues getting to, affecting the NHS, the better. So the more we can kind of bring pandemics into kind of a broader range of conversations, I think the better. And I also think, so for me, there's a geopolitical focus that we need to bring to it, which is that, for me, as Ines pointed to, I talk a lot about our strategic rivals. So if we look, for example, towards China, China's involvement, and lots of people know about the Bereaved Initiative, but more broadly, particularly in developing nations, it's growing its influence. I was literally having a chat with my Uber driver on the way here about the influence of China on Cape Verde, which I didn't know about, but it's extensive apparently, just been on holiday there. And actually, health is one of the areas where the UK really does lead from the front. Health, science, etc. is a real soft power asset for us. And actually, increasingly in a world where everyone's looking at hard power, there is a role for our soft power, particularly as a kind of counter to places like China. And actually, there's a real opportunity there, I think, as well.
Yeah, no, really wonderful, thank you. And actually, we're seeing some of that where actually I'm working with many different countries around the world, and some of them in the Middle East, where they're seen as UK as real leaders in the life science sector today. But there is some kind of, I don't know, they're saying without saying it, as in that the UK is not going to be a leader for too long, is what they're thinking, based on kind of current politics in the life science, which is obviously very worrying for us, and so fully agree with that. I'm going to now turn over to Zander and talk a little bit more about how Britain can collaborate with our international partners to strengthen global pandemic preparedness and ensure more of a coordinated response. Big question.
That is a big question. Yeah, I'll cover everything in 90 seconds. I think the first thing to point out is that we did not do a good job in international partnership in COVID. At the beginning of the COVID response, people were talking about this thing called COVAX and the ACT-A accelerator, which was meant to be a global solidarity approach to providing vaccines and therapeutics and diagnostics to the people who needed it most first. And this was something that everybody signed up to with great sort of, enthusiasm and solidarity until the point at which there actually was a vaccine, at which point rich countries, including the UK, just hoarded all the vaccines to ourselves. And I think that was a big sort of turning point, really, in a lot of places across the global south, of realising that rich countries may talk a good game on these things, but they weren't actually going to overcome or counteract or ignore their domestic political realities of when people are dying and they're letting the bodies pile up in hospitals with COVID. Theoretically, intellectually, it makes sense to send the vaccines where they're needed most, but practically that wasn't seen to be politically possible. And it wasn't just in the UK, that was around the world, and even in India, where the Serum Institute had committed to export millions of vaccines to the places where they were needed most. When COVID rates in India spiked, Prime Minister Modi, unsurprisingly, did exactly what leaders in the rest of the world have been doing and said, well, no, we're going to keep them here. So I think in terms of how we better collaborate with international partners, there's a balance to be struck between recognising political realities and domestic pressures, and so setting up a system that's more resilient. So that will include better regional manufacturing of vaccines, so that it's not just a few big hubs that are in big countries and therefore more likely to keep them to themselves in the event of another pandemic. I think that also links to improved surveillance. so that we see things quicker. And some of the ways in which it took a long time for the response to COVID to get going was partly to do with political issues around the World Health Organization, which need to be fully considered and improved in the future. And in terms of ensuring a coordinated response, during COVID we saw quite a lot of different political initiatives being launched around pandemic preparedness and response and prevention, such as this pandemic accord or treaty, which is being negotiated through the World Health Organization. And there was also a high-level meeting on these issues at the United Nations General Assembly last month. And when these things were set up, COVID was on the front page of the newspapers every day, and everyone was terribly worried about it. And then around the same time, uncoincidentally, as the invasion of Ukraine, the political attention shifted as the COVID pandemic ceased to be such a pandemic threat to everyone. And I've worked on global health issues for about 15 years, and I've never seen any issue going from being the top of the agenda to completely off the agenda in literally about 6 weeks. And so now we have these processes like the Pandemic Accord, this global treaty, which is a really good idea, but which is basically being negotiated at a very technical level, and that political engagement has completely gone. So I think if we want to ensure a coordinated response in the future, we need to make sure that there's sustained political will and political engagement to make sure these things are important. You mentioned the integrated reviews. In the last integrated review, there was actually quite a lot of language on pandemic preparedness. It is recognised at a technical level as being a bigger global threat than it was perceived to be before COVID, and that's a good thing. But we need, if we're going to collaborate better with international partners, to just not only have these collaborations at a technical level, but we also need to make sure that political leaders, like Wayne, are taking these seriously and raising them in the Middle East and North Africa. We are talking about how Saudi Arabia has some of the best surveillance and is a leader regionally on pandemic preparedness, because with the Hajj, every year they have more people coming in from all parts of the world than almost anywhere else does in the world on a regular basis. So they need to really know what people are coming in with. And the COVID vaccine that was developed at Oxford University and then sent around the world with AstraZeneca actually started life as a MERS vaccine, which was against the Middle East respiratory illness that came out of that region. So it's a global issue, it needs a global response, and we need the UK to step up.
Thank you so much, Zander. We'll turn to you, Wayne, now to discuss a bit more about how Britain can leverage its soft power, and Evie mentioned some of this and so did Zander, and diplomatic efforts, but how to build more alliances, and specifically we think about the region you're focused on, Middle East and North Africa, probably the most complex.
Thanks so much, Lee. Could I begin by just making a few general points, which are, I think, are relevant to what we're discussing. I think that one of the huge challenges of modern government is to get governments working together and having an integrated approach. Britain is afflicted by government departmentalism. Every single department is almost hermetically sealed and pursues its own agenda, sometimes outside of a coherent government strategy. Now, I'm not just saying this, but one of the things the last Labour government did with Tony Blair as Prime Minister was have a greater extent of coordination between government departments, led by Number 10. Now, that clearly doesn't exist at the moment. So that fundamental building block, I think, is essential for a Labour government to actually get a set of strategies agreed in place and be implemented methodically by every single government department in a complementary way. So I think that kind of perspective is really important. I just give a few examples. I mean, most people think of foreign policy in terms of diplomacy. And there's been a big effort to try and have greater coordination with Ministry of Defence, for example. And the integrated review is indicative, I think, of that kind of sensible thinking. But as has been said, one of the indications from the integrated review is that initially there's very little emphasis or mention given towards preparedness for pandemics. things have moved on, the refresh of the integrated review is better. And there's been modifications with regard to obviously what's happening with Russia and Ukraine and a number of areas as well, but also a more substantial comment about preparedness for pandemics. So that is a step forward. But it's been a step forward by civil servants, to be perfectly honest, because I don't see any political reflection of that inside the politicians of government. That is indicative, I've got to be honest, of the malaise which generally afflicts government at the moment. There is no coherent government in this country anymore. It's all putting forward simplistic, knee-jerk reactions, populist pieces of legislation, to be honest with you, in preparation for the general election, which might well be a year away. So actually creating a new kind of government in this country is the fundamental starting point. And I've got to say again, not because of our esteemed chair, but the Tony Blair Institute is actually providing some very, very useful work on what can be done in so many respects. And I've had a lot of contact with regard to my work in the Middle East with the Tony Blair Institute. But clearly that needs to be expanded to other shadow ministers as well. Yeah. Another example, I mentioned the Foreign Office. Recently, of course, there was the merger between the Foreign Commonwealth Office and the Department of International Development. I think it'd be a mistake personally to get into a debate which has been going on for some time, whether or not if federal Labour governments are separate those two departments, or whether or not that's for me not the real issue. What the real issue is what is done, with that department or two departments or whatever. And that principle of integration is very, very important. But also when we talk about international trade, international development, we tend to talk about international grant aid more than anything else. Yeah. That's important, 0.7% when it's affordable. That's important, of course it is. But also, equally important is the policies which are pursued by government in terms of trade. That is a vitally important element of international development, which is all too often not recognised. If we talk about climate change, that is a fundamentally important point in terms of the direction of travel and how we perceive, international development. And that's not fully integrated into our thinking and practice. So that's very important. Second point I make is that I think it's extremely important that we develop meaningful international relationships once again. Right? The underlying thinking of the most reactionary elements inside the Conservative Party is that the way forward is Britain in splendid isolation. We tell the world what to do. We tell the world what we want. We go back to the great days of something like Jacob Rees-Mogg here, the great days of the British Empire and so on. We've got to engage with the modern world as it is. And that means having relationships on the basis of mutual respect and recognising that Britain is not and never will be and nor should be a great superpower. We are an influential country. Let's not forget that. Our influence has been systematically undermined and our national respect across the world has been undermined over the last few years. We've got to build that up. But we do it, for being true to our word, for focusing on issues which people are concerned about, and about the rule of law. Those are some of the key principles we have to focus on. And he mentioned the Middle East. I think that's one area which we, as a Labour government, have to focus on. Britain's engagement in the Middle East has been devalued formally by this government. There's not even a shadow minister for the Middle East. The minister concerned is in the Lords, his responsibilities in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, elements of trade, the United Nations, all important areas. And in fairness, he's one of the better government ministers. But I mean, nevertheless, there needs to be a strategic focus on the Middle East for a whole host of different reasons, one of which is the work which has been mentioned already in terms of scientific developments and the significance the Middle East and countries like Saudi Arabia will have in the future. Like it or not, that's the reality, and we have to engage with that reality. The final point I make is that I think it's really this meeting in a sense is important because despite what's happening in the Middle East as we speak, and my mind has obviously been focused on that very much for the last few days. Having a meeting like this does focus my mind, on the longer term set of policies and approach that we need to have.
Yeah.
So I think it's important that we focus on the immediate issues at the moment, but also we need to have a coherent approach for government, and preparedness for pandemics must be an essential part of that approach, which requires domestic policy coordination and a foreign policy perspective.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you so much. So I'm also seeing, question actually for anyone on the panel, I'm seeing with the governments or ministries of health that I work with, I'm seeing all across the world more of this kind of inward thinking in terms of investments. So practically every government I talk to, they're investing in vaccine manufacturing. Everybody's doing mRNA vaccine manufacturing locally. In Canada, who didn't really have much before, are focusing more. Saudi Arabia are focusing more. Across Africa, we're looking at regional manufacturing, and actually some of these plants are not going to be used for a long time, but it's just more of a kind of a security issue, which is fine. But are you concerned? We mentioned Evie and Wayne and Zander. You mentioned UK's somewhat kind of disappeared off the national stage at the moment in terms of international development and sort of collaboration. I'm not sure what presence they had at UNGA in the last few weeks when we were discussing pandemic cord and lots of other important.
Oliver Dowden did a great job.
You did. But what about other countries? Are you seeing more of this inward thinking from other parts of the world as well? And are you seeing less of sort of interactions with Britain as well? Is there anything we can do? So this is for anyone on the panel.
I'll have a go. Yeah. I think there's been a lot more nationalism and populism that's nothing to do with global health. It's to do with the sort of domestic political scene that we've seen. I think that on some level, we're living in a more and more multipolar world, and within that there's going to be more regional hubs that are going to be more important. And I think that the only upside from the fact that the G7 and the West completely let down the global South during COVID was that it encouraged a lot, particularly of the bigger middle income countries, to think, well, we really do need to take this stuff more seriously. And I think that the risk then is that, like you say, everyone starts looking inwardly, and you get very much sort of competition and vaccine nationalism. And there is a geopolitical fight going on between Russia, China, building their influence. Some of that through health diplomacy. They were very generous with their vaccines. I think there are varying levels of efficacy with them, but that was a very noticeable sort of difference, I think. And the way in which I would hope that could become an opportunity is one of the things that we're seeing is an increased focus on partnerships between our research institutes and building the capacity of research institutes in the Global South. And that kind of partnership is important because there is this political reality that when pandemics hit, and there will be another one, people pull the drawbridge up. However, the extent and the way in which that plays out from a practical perspective in terms of sharing of knowledge, sharing of intellectual property, sharing of expertise and capacity doesn't necessarily need to be entirely linked to what will be a slightly inevitable domestic political pressure. If the partnerships and the links between these different regions and institutions and ways of working are strong enough in advance, and actually in some ways it was amazing the extent to which COVID vaccines were developed so quickly, in which expertise and manufacturing was built up in different places. but a lot of it was starting from a standing start or massively scaling up partnerships which had previously been little more than pilot projects. So I think that's the opportunity that we need to seize now, and that does take investment. And yesterday we were doing a panel of scientists for Labour with the head of the Pandemic Institute here in Liverpool, which is a sort of cross-university and city-wide effort. And that Pandemic Institute is good for Liverpool and the region because it builds capacity and creates jobs and expertise and all those sorts of things. But I think they've got over sort of 40 partnerships around the world in Africa and Asia and Latin America and across Europe and North America. And we need more of those sorts of institutes with stronger partnerships with different regions to make sure that we're better prepared next time.
Wonderful, thank you. I mean, when I was at the side events at Alga a few weeks ago, I'm not going to talk about the private sector today, but I did hear a CEO of a very big pharma company say that we need a pragmatic approach to equitable access, which I thought was interesting. So we've got a long way to go. Okay, Clara, I'm going to turn back to the UK, Britain again, and think about how, Wayne mentioned about how we need more of a coordinated approach across government, but I want to think about the devolved governments and how we can work together better.
Well, I think that the chief medical officers and the chief scientific advisors, from what's come out of the inquiry so far, were not, for the devolved nations, weren't invited to come and speak, to be part of SAGE or to be in kind of coordinated correspondence with the chief medical officers and scientific officers of the Westminster government. For example, in Northern Ireland as well, I don't think any scientific advice was given to any minister for years and years in the lead up to the pandemic. And so I think that there needs to be greater transparency, but in kind of all areas of scientific advice being given to government. And that is not just between the governments, but also for the population as well, because as the pandemic has shown, the degree to which these decisions impact people's day-to-day lives is, I don't think anyone's going to underestimate that from now on. And also the amount of civil compliance that you need has gone up as well. And I think that as what the pandemic has done is show reliance on scientific expertise, but also shown how critical and nervous of scientific expertise some of the population can be. So I think, we need greater transparency between the devolved nations. But also, we need to think about the fact that pandemics and other kind of crises as well the land borders are the thing, not borders between the north and south of Ireland, and we probably need to have kind of all island approaches to future pandemics, and that's something that's come out of the inquiry as well, and that has been spoken about by kind of politicians across Northern Ireland. I also think that from what I've understood, the national risk assessment system has kind of flowed from Westminster and hasn't taken in enough kind of advice and information from local governments and also local authorities within local governments. So I think there needs to just be a kind of a redrawing of that system of how the information flows from devolved nations into the centre. That's a good.
Could I say just?
Please.
As a Welshman, I mean, I would just make a couple of comments which really complement what you've said from my own experience living in South Wales through the pandemic. It's worth making the basic point. The response in Wales was much better than the response in England. That's because Wales had Mark Drakeford, a serious, measured, thoughtful, intelligent politician, and England had Boris Johnson. And that made a heck of a difference. But the other point I make is that the Conservative government has a problem with devolution, full stop. It doesn't like devolution, doesn't respect devolution. Is always at odds with Scottish Parliament, lesser extent to Welsh Senate. And I think that the starting point has got to be a better relationship. But the sensible relationship you have with something like this, where politics, traditionally defined, shouldn't come into it. It's what works best and what is effective. And it just makes sense, really, for representatives of the devolved institutions to be involved in the decision making and administration, really, in dealing with something like this. That should automatically happen as a common sense thing to do. There shouldn't be political impediments put in place as what happened in the pandemic. So that's one of the key lessons. We have to have a system of government which goes beyond short-term petty party politics, and puts the broader interests of the country and of its people first and foremost.
Thank you so much. So Clara mentioned the trust and kind of scientific expertise has increased somewhat, and in some parts of the world or some parts of the country it's gone down. My understanding is that trust in government has diminished. So Evie, if I can turn to you, I know you do lots of work with public perception, and just want to get your thoughts there, because I'm really worried actually the next time we have a pandemic, which is going to happen, and I'm even worried about compliance if we need to implement some of these non-pharmaceutical interventions, more stringent ones, in say the winter. Are people actually going to comply? And my feeling is no. So what are your thoughts there?
I think you probably, Sadie, are right. I think one of the real challenges that we have is that during the pandemic there was kind of this section of the population that was kind of conspiracy theorist, and that actually was a segment, and we did lots of focus groups at the time, and the majority of people were broadly supportive, they were broadly on board. I think particularly post-Partygate, actually it's less of a conspiracy theorist group and a much wider segment of the population who are incredibly frustrated with a lot of what happened during COVID, and are very frustrated in government in general, that's reflected. But particularly we also see it in foreign policy, and a view in kinds of engagement with the world has also kind of backtracked because of the pandemic. There's a greater concern that actually these big international institutions all over the world are coming from us, almost they're taking our sovereignty. They're kind of the arguments you saw during Brexit. And I think there's a real challenge that as you look at these global issues, there's a concern about engaging on a kind of multilateral level, and as you say, kind of engagement with the kind of actual rules that are kind of occurring within the country because people don't trust the government. And I think going into likely another pandemic at some point, we really have to think about how we frame a lot of this, and how we frame pandemic preparedness. So, for example, international development is ultimately, unfortunately, very unpopular, particularly ODA spending. So our most recent survey, which we did in May, we found that just 14% of Britons want 0.7% restored now. Just 14%. Really, 1/4. Very, very low. A higher proportion want it cut entirely. So, as a broad spectrum, aid is not a popular thing. But what is popular is defence spending. So there's the majority of Britons believe we should increase defence spending to 2.5%. Okay, well there's a strategic way. Obviously there's an argument for increasing support for aid, and there's a whole conversation around that, and I would love to go into that at some point, but a conversation for another time. There's also a way in which we frame things like pandemic preparedness around security, because it is ultimately a security issue. Our resilience, our supply chains, our health resilience is incredibly important for our long-term security. And actually, if you bring that into the conversation, people often think of security in terms of bombs and guns, etc. But actually, the more we can kind of broaden what's conceived as security, and I think actually the IR refresh, to its credit, does do that. It talks a lot about resilience more broadly. The more we can do that, I think the more we can bring the public with us in kind of building support for long-term pandemic preparedness, and actually preparing ourselves mentally for this isn't a one-off thing. This is an issue that's going to recur again and again, and the more we can bring the public with us in preparing for that eventuality of another pandemic, the better.
Fantastic. I wonder if there's anyone in the room who works in health policy or global health policy, because I do agree with you wholly, actually, Evie, but one of the things we were taught when I studied global health policy is that global health started off as international health, and very much the focus was on these tropical foreign diseases coming from abroad. And so one of the problems with having this security approach to global health is the kind of the fear of the unknown and the fear of people coming from other countries. So, I mean, I don't know if there's any, that's just a comment I'd like to make, so I do agree with you, but I do think that there's something we'd have to do to ensure that doesn't happen. So there could be some kind of negative associations with that as well, unfortunately. Tricky balance, I think, to strike. Well, I'm going to go to the audience for questions in a bit. So I'm just going to ask a few more questions. Let me see. Yeah, I think the question that probably is top of mind is kind of purse strings. So obviously those of us who work in the world of health, we want more investment in our health system in general, so that actually we don't have to use some of these very harsh non-pharmaceutical interventions like lockdown, because our hospitals and our healthcare system would be able to cope with more people going to hospital. And also invest in pandemic preparedness policies and coordination, all the things that we mentioned today. And you've touched on this slightly already, but I'm going to ask each of you, the very important question is, how do you think voters will feel about investing more in pandemic preparedness, which I believe the Labour Party would do? And how then, the tricky question, how can we position this as being favourable, other than the great idea of focusing on the security issues that you've mentioned? So I'm going to turn to Zander.
How do we build public support for it?
Yes.
I think it's really difficult. I mean, I think we have to make the case that it is something that is in our own interests, essentially. And I take your concern on the security point, but equally, I think this is an interesting comparison with the way in which climate change has sort of risen up the political agenda, and climate change for years was sort of campaigned for as something that was important for the world, and also something that is scientifically very complicated but very important, or was something that was going to mean that everyone had to go and sort of live in a cave and not have an electricity or a car. And those sorts of approaches were not very successful for public engagement. And I think over the last sort of 5 to 10 years, you've seen a massive transformation in terms of how climate is viewed by the public. Sadly, we've seen the government backtracking on net zero recently, but the public and most people seem to still recognise that climate change is really important. We've also seen more climate-related sort of impacts and floods and droughts and those sorts of things, and sadly, it seems that we need more of those sorts of events to kind of make people continue to remember that this stuff is important. But I think for pandemics, there's a lot to learn from the climate movement around how you frame something that is difficult and technical and affects everyone into something that is seen as being in our best interests, and reshaping it away from something that is just about overseas development aid and being kind to other people in the rest of the world, and more as something that is about protecting ourselves and keeping us safe whilst also doing something that is good for the world. It's critical because we're living in very difficult times, and in the time of the cost of living crisis, the moral argument still does hold. It's still really important to help those people who are less fortunate than ourselves, but we also need to make sure that we're making the case that this is a hard-headed, well thought through, sensible thing that's good for us and good for the world.
Fantastic. Can I ask what you say?
I agree very much with that. I mean, there are looming on the horizons huge issues for all countries. We're talking about potential and probably likely pandemics to arise in the future. But I mean, we talk about the issue of migration. I mean, migration is not going to stop when we have a Labour government. And we're going to have increasing movements of people from different parts of the world because of climate change, from sub-Saharan Africa, North Africa, with increasing water levels. People in Bangladesh, for example, will be moving on a massive extent because of the rising level of the sea. I mean, these issues are massive issues, which we have to confront, not as the government has attempted to do it now, nonsense. They're talking about putting into effect, but we need to have a long-term, honest discussion with our partners throughout the world, and the British people, to know what a future government is grappling with. Could I also say, I think that the issue of security is absolutely important. People in the modern world feel insecure, and I believe that we need to define government as being proactive and enabling. not as top-down government telling people what to do, but a proactive government which helps to set the agenda, works with people, works with the private sector, works with the population as a whole. And that needs just a fundamental change in mindset. And I actually honestly believe people criticise Keir Starmer for not being charismatic enough. But I think the cardinal thing is that he's being honest with people. Now, it might sound a bit corny, but I think that is so important. We need to have a bond of trust internationally and domestically. And we need to address issues in a systematic and honest way. I really believe that is the future for modern government. And the issue of investment is important. And again, we have to be honest with people. There is not a magic money tree. We have to have a different approach towards how we generate money and finance in this country. And it has to be sustainable. I think the emphasis on sustainable growth is so important to the development of this whole agenda and many, many others as well.
I don't know why we keep losing mics. I'm not sure where they go.
I'm sorry.
Keeps on putting them down there.
Thank you. Really quickly turn to Clara and then Evie, and then we'll go to the audience questions.
I think in the inquiry, I think it was Oliver Letwin said, it's very, very hard to convince a population that you should be spending money on something that might never happen. And also, if it does happen, it's also something you don't really want to talk to the population about because it's pretty bleak. And I think that is, that is a problem, and it's a political decision that you need to take. That politicians need to take this responsibility on behalf of other people. It's not particularly sexy to bring change. Who has responsibility for resilience and preparedness within government, but it needs to happen. And I think that it ties in very well with this with Keir Starmer's idea of politics treading lightly on people's lives. Part of that is putting in all of the resilience and the preparedness behind the scenes, and I think again that ties in with the climate stuff because it's those same systems, the capabilities to scale up response to crises is across the board. And I'm really glad that in this conference that's been really front and centre. The only other thing I would say though is that as much as not political, but kind of social commentators and the media may have decided that nobody cares about the pandemic anymore, the scale of loss in the UK was so large. 230,000 people lost loved ones. And voters won't forget that, The media might not want to talk about it, but they won't forget the way that they couldn't see their grandfather as he was dying in a care home with, holding a woolen heart, instead of a hand. So I think that it still will interest voters.
And just really quickly, I'm sorry. There are two specific things I think that reflect in the broader kind of conversation around aid, which are quite useful, I think, for pandemic preparedness as well. One is I always caution against focusing too much on money, in that I think the aid sector has really got up in the 0.7, 0.5 debate, which makes sense because that's actually quite a big difference financially, of course. But the conversation then becomes about money rather than what you're actually trying to do with that money and the good outcomes that can come from it. So I'd really caution against, because I've seen a number floating around that it should be 0.04%, which is obviously a very tiny number in the grand scheme of things, and actually looks like quite a tiny number, so maybe you'd get support for it. But in general, I'm always cautious of focusing the conversation on specific numbers rather than on the doing. And similarly, I always try to push towards a focus on success. And I think it's something that the aid sector in general has tried to do recently quite a lot, and moving away from kind of the crying child on your screen on Red Nose Day and towards that, okay, this is a brilliant thing that we've been able to achieve by doing this, and celebrating vaccine successes, for example, is a really good way to do this, to show that actually we're not pouring money down a black hole. This money is achieving something and it's affecting people's lives in a really positive way. I think that is often, it's not sexy, but actually long term the narrative it builds is much more powerful.
Absolutely, fully agree with that. I'm now going to turn to the audience.